Now on to things we need to know about Afghanistan in 2012, and there couldn't be a better journalist in New Zealand to tell us about the situation in Afghanistan than Jon Stephenson, freelance journalist, joining us now. Jon, thanks for coming on in.
My pleasure.
Let's first of all, rather than look ahead so much, let's talk about your experiences in Afghanistan in 2011, because you went over there, and then that resulted in the Metro article eventually, Eyes Wide Shut. How long did you spend over there?
On that particular trip, I spent about 4 weeks, and it was a continuation of work that I'd done earlier. For example, I'd had a trip the previous year in which I'd sort of laid the groundwork for much of the work that followed. But it was a very intense 4 weeks, as you can imagine, and sometimes you're really up against it. You've got to try and find people. You don't always know where they are or if they're still alive, and you've got language problems, cultural problems, the problems of dealing with the military and the secret police. So
because you're not going through the New Zealand military channels to get access to anything there, are you? You're very much out on your own.
That's correct. Yeah, I'm completely outside the military bubble, and of course there's a place for reporting on the military. No one's ever saying that the military shouldn't be reported on. They've got a very important story to tell. But I think when there's a war on, journalists should be very fussy about not just reporting their side or their country's side of the conflict inside the military tent, as it were, but going out onto the streets and talking to the people whose country is being occupied, who are being affected most, particularly the women and children, by a very violent and very vicious conflict. Yeah,
indeed. Now, and you were specifically investigating torture in Afghanistan and the fact that New Zealand troops had handed over prisoners that were eventually tortured, whether knowingly or not. I mean, was that always going to be your aim, to find out what was going on there with that, or did it just become apparent that was the story?
No, I'd been pursuing that for quite some time, and on previous trips to the Middle East, to Iraq, I've had a lot of assignments there over the years, and previous trip to Afghanistan, or during the war when I was there, it was very, very apparent that there's a great deal of mistreatment and torture and outright killing of prisoners by some of the local people. That's not to suggest in any way that New Zealand or any of our forces have behaved in that way, but it was something that sort of took a while for me to click. I guess sometimes you define yourself as a journalist by the stories you don't get. Yeah. And I was one of those journalists who was in Iraq and was told things about people being picked up and mistreated, in some cases tortured or abused. And I didn't get the Abu Ghraib story. I don't think anyone else did really. Maybe a couple of American networks had it in the end. But I always looked back and thought, gee, I should have picked up more on that, because it was obvious from what we were being told that something was amiss. And I guess it got me thinking about what was New Zealand's role in this US-led, quote, war on terror, unquote. And it's very, very clear that in the war on terror there's been a lot of less than stellar treatment of people in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I knew, of course, that most New Zealand troops had been based in Iraq, and wanted to know what our role was in the system. And
since then, and since the article came out, your reputation came into question.
Yes,
there were some harsh words from the
very harsh words from the Prime Minister and also from the Chief of Defence Force, Lieutenant General Rhys Jones.
Do you feel there's been a cover-up?
Well, unlike other journalists, I often sort of consider the cock-up theory of history rather than the cover-up theory, but certainly there was a concerted attempt to keep the truth from the public. You can call that a cover-up if you like. I think certainly wars these days are fought very much in the media as opposed to just on the ground. What the public knows about what goes on in Afghanistan depends to a great extent on what our media tells them. Our media just hasn't had a lot of access and a lot of money. Journalists haven't been sent over, and of course it's very risky, very dangerous to go over there and wander around Afghanistan on your own and try and do this sort of work.
So is it true that newsrooms just don't want to pay for that risk?
By and large, that's true, and you can't blame journalists as well, people who've got wives and kids, or husbands and kids, not wanting to go over and take that risk. But I guess the point is that you cannot rely on the government or the military in a time of war to tell you everything that's necessarily not in their interest to say. Yeah,
we're talking with Jon Stephenson about Afghanistan, freelance journalist, of course, Jon Stephenson. Would it be fair to say that in 2011 Afghanistan became a more dangerous place, or at least the conflict there intensified?
Yes, I think that would be fair to say. I mean, it's there are differences, of course, in how you measure these things, but I think the essential measure of a counterinsurgency, which is what's happening in Afghanistan, whether it's going successfully or not, is whether the occupying forces have, or the government that they've put in place, for example the Karzai administration, whether that government has the support of the people. Because as Phil Goff and many other strategists over the years have pointed out, you cannot be successful if the people are against you, if the bulk of the people are against you. And I think it's very clear that the Karzai government is widely perceived, certainly by the Afghans who we need to have this, who needs to back them, as venal, corrupt, inefficient, in many cases brutal, and just simply not up to the task of delivering things to the Afghan people that they feel that they need for their lives.
Are they democratic?
Well, that's another very good question. Democracy in the Afghan context is something that's always going to have to be taken with a degree of a grain of salt, because this is a country that doesn't have a long history of democracy. I mean, we see in the West countries like Britain and New Zealand, for that matter, that have a long history of democracy, that we don't always get things right. For example, Britain has 22% of its population, 22% of British Parliament are women. Now, we went into Afghanistan and we demanded that a country with no experience of democracy along the lines of Britain put 25% of their women in Parliament. That 25% of their Parliament be women.
Yeah.
And there's a certain irony there that in some ways we expect more of them than we're prepared to show ourselves, despite the fact we've got much more experience. We've set up these very elaborate constitutions and very elaborate rules of operating that frankly they have very little experience in, and perhaps it would have been better to go more gradually and to involve the Afghans much more in the process.
So it would be fair to say that they didn't really have much of an input into the design process of their constitution.
They had some input, but there were whole groups that were left out. And for example, the Taliban, whether you like them or not, and of course a lot of people had a very bad experience with the Taliban, but they were a group that had a sizable constituency, and they were people that had some experience running Afghanistan for 5 years, and it seems very clear that they should have been involved to some extent. And even today, for example, there's very little negotiation actually going on with the Taliban, when it's very likely that they will be a major player in the future and what happens there.
Because if they have a certain amount of support from the population, then does that need to be respected by the West?
Yes, of course it does. The point is that the Pashtun people, Afghanistan's sort of a bit of an ethnic quilt, but the largest group are ethnic Pashtuns, and they're the group from which the Taliban are overwhelmingly drawn. They have been traditionally the rulers of Afghanistan, and since the fall of the Taliban, the Pashtun have been left out very much of government. I mean, Karzai's a Pashtun, but a lot of the positions are taken up, a lot of the key military and security positions, for example, are taken up by Tajiks, and that leaves a sort of a degree of ill feeling that they've been perhaps hard done by as a result of this new democracy.
Yeah. What about New Zealand's involvement in 2011? Did our role, or even prior to 2011, did it change significantly? I mean, we seem to be having these SAS troops that are on the front line.
Well, it hasn't changed significantly in the last year. What happened was that the Labour government, Helen Clark's government, in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks, sent SAS troops to Afghanistan, as is well known. Their whole deployment was shrouded in secrecy. We didn't really know what they were doing. You may remember at one stage there were rumours that they were building latrines in Kabul or something like that. And Clark made a sort of a acerbic comment about, I don't think that's their core business activity. But we basically didn't know what they were doing for a long time. And I think, frankly, that was probably a sensible policy from the government and military perspective, because it kept them out of the news. Not great from the public need-to-know perspective, but...
do we need to know?
Well, of course we do. We don't need to know when they're going on an operation and all the details of their secret operations and equipment. But I think
we need to know if they're in a combat role, or if they're in a reconstruction role, or a support role.
I think you can always assume that the SAS will be in a combat role, because that's the nature of their work. But I think what you saw happen was when Willie Apiata was awarded his VC, and when the SAS got their US Presidential Unit citation, there was a flurry of publicity around all that, and in some ways the Defence Force management or leadership opened the door, and I think they then thought that they could just shut it equally as quickly, and that hasn't been the case. And when the SAS got redeployed in 2009, they were just deployed to Kabul. Now that's a city where every journalist and every Western journalist that's in Kabul usually is based there. So it was inevitable that something would come out, that
Yeah.
they would be seen on the streets because of their mission, and there would be questions raised, photos taken, and I think that was probably a major mistake, sending them back to that location. But as it turns out, it's led to a lot greater discussion about what the SAS are doing there and should they be there.
Jon Stephenson, freelance journalist, is with us, and we're looking at what to expect from Afghanistan in 2012, and we'll go into that a little bit more because John's about to head back off there, and of course we've heard that the New Zealand SAS are meant to pull out, so that's up next. Right now